Driving change in maritime. Welcome to another episode of Teqplay Vodcast series. I will have a conversation with Rob Koggel, an expert and consultant for port call optimization. The topic for today is operational excellence in port calling. Tune in for our discussion. Rob, welcome in our podcast. Good to have you in our studio and to have a conversation about port call optimization. One of the passions I really have. That is why I actually took a deep dive into the ports. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But before we dive into the content and the topics, maybe it's good to give a brief introduction of who you are. I know you're very knowledgeable about port call optimization. That will be the discussion of today, but maybe can you introduce you quickly and shortly to the audience?
Of course. My name is Rob Koggel. I work as a freelance port optimization specialist or consultant. I would say mainly serving two types of customers. One is ports and companies imports, and the other kind of companies I would say are more IT related because nowadays port optimization most of the time also have an IT component, so that's the other kind of customers I serve.
Okay, and I'm curious, I know why I got addicted to port calls. I saw these vessels and I saw a lot of data, but what is your passion about port call and port call optimization? Where does it come from?
That I started working in maritime, that's maybe a little bit of a coincidence. After university, I was looking for a traineeship related to transport because I was really into transport and moving things. And then I found a traineeship in the maritime industry. And from the first moment I got into ports and indeed saw the big vessels and the big cranes and everything, it touched me and I stayed, I would say forever, but at least until now. Okay. And about port optimization, I'm really into excellence. How can you optimize things and how can you make things more efficient? That's also what I do in my daily life. Even when I'm at home, I try to optimize everything around me. So that's also, I would say a passion to do.
Okay, cool, nice. And one of the questions I always ask is what is the thing that most people don't realize if they look at a port or they are thinking about port call optimization? What is the thing that people do not see or should know about port call optimization?
I think the scale, because the scale, we already said the big vessels, the big cranes. Sometimes just a very small change can make a very big impact, like saving 15 minutes on every port call. You're talking about savings of millions in euros and also a lot of tons in CO2 reduction. So every small change really makes a difference. And that's, I think, totally different if you compare it to other industries.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's like, it is, if you look for impact, you will see impact in different numbers. It's indeed in the reduction. It is indeed in minutes saved, but I always had a hard time in seeing what is this scale actually? How does this multiply? By how many times do you need to multiply it? And what is then the impact? And I think if you look at one port, it are already significant number, let alone if you actually start looking at the global scale and connecting all the dots in the maritime network in that sense.
For sure, yeah.
If you've been on this journey, I think already for 15 years or something, 10, 15 years, more or less. If you think about successes that you have seen, what are the things that you have seen in port call optimization where it was successful and where it did really have an impact?
I think maybe to start first, what changed over the years from when I started until now is there's a little bit different focus where 10, 15 years ago, the main focus when you spoke about port optimization was about saving money. How can you save money for the involved stakeholders? Nowadays, you see it's more around sustainability. So how can you save tons of CO2 or other emissions? In the end, I think the things we do don't differ that much because the main things that save money also save CO2. So in the end, we do the same.
Bunker costs are the big one, the big variable.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say the big successes. I think stakeholder. I think there are a lot of stakeholders involved when you speak about protocol optimization. It's not you cannot do it by just one party. You need more stakeholders in the chain. Where I would say 15 years ago, everyone was trying to optimize their own part of the puzzle. Now more and more companies are working together to get the whole chain connected and optimized. That's, I think, a big win. You see more and more ports worldwide start implementing protocol optimization measures, like, for example, just-in-time. Sailings is becoming more and more on the agenda. I know it still goes slow. We are not there. But at least there are steps taken.
Yeah, it's always it's a big machine, as you were mentioning before. Yeah. So it is really also taking a step-by-step approach.
Yeah, and also when you speak about just-in-time, I've done that project for a few ports, or at least the start of these kind of projects for a few ports worldwide. And it's also not that you are just rolling out just-in-time. What happens is that first, before you can even think about just-in-time, you have to look into the port. Is the port ready to do just-in-time? Other nautical services, is their availability good enough to do just-in-time? Is the arrival times at terminals good enough? So a lot of side projects you have to do first before you can actually go to the holy grail of just-in-time sailings. And that first projects you have to take as a port, they are, I would say, extremely important, but I think many times overseen by the big audience, because it's work on the ground that has to be done first. Yeah. Also with a lot of savings, but less attention, I would say.
Okay. And if you, that is this highly collaborative nature of a port call with many stakeholders involved, including bunkers being delivered in port, as you mentioned, the nautical service providers being available. Now it looks like it has traction, what did change in that respect? Why does it find more traction now? Why are people more involved? I can recall the first meetings on port call optimization, and everyone was really looking into their own process, their own silo, was actually concerned about sharing information. Any ideas, or what made the difference that people started to collaborate more in that sense?
Yeah, I think there are many reasons. I think one of the easy reasons that these kind of things take time. So there is time passed by since the first time we talked about protocol optimization, I think. So yeah, this time passing by also makes it easier to do that. On the other hand, I would say that the more focus there is now on sustainability and CO2 reduction, that also allows us to work more on protocol optimization. Okay. You also see more and more regulations by, for example, IMO or by European Union, maybe also in some national laws, they force protocol optimization. For example, IMO doesn't have anything to say about ports. They have a say about what happens on the seas, but not the ports are under local jurisdiction. But in the end, if you have to wait for your port call, and that counts for example, your CII rating, which is an IMO regulation, then more and more customers of the port, so the carriers, they will force the port to do more on optimization. So it's maybe not direct, but it's at least indirect how they optimize.
Yeah, I get that. And that's also one of the things I've noticed. Like regulation does help in that sense to push things forward. Otherwise, there are too many people who can independently make a choice to not join, and if you do not join, I think the whole game falls apart in that sense.
Yeah, you need everyone, and I think the last reason why it's getting more traction is that more people or more actors in the process become digitized. So when 10 years ago, maybe they still, as that moment in time, they thought it can be a good idea, but they were not able to share their data, for example. Nowadays, with better systems and more integrations, they are able to share data, which even is the first of the first reasons, or for first, one of the first things you need to have in place to be able to take part in portal optimization.
Yeah, I see that like institutes, organizations like DCSA coming up with the standards for the carriers to actually do the information exchange. I think that is also an important contribution to that one.
At least for containers.
For containers, yes. Yeah. On dry bulk, there are different initiatives. We've got the Global Maritime Forum, and there are many things going on. But I do see as well there's a lot more traction, and it's a good point. I really like also the statement. It takes time. I think it takes time to build trust in that part to bring that forward on that one. If we're talking about optimization, port call optimization, that implies change. What have you seen examples of how people are driving change in this industry? What are good examples? What are lessons learned that you have encountered in your journey?
Yeah, so port optimization for me, it implies that you make a change that is cost effective. So it doesn't need a very big amount of money upfront. So for example, changing to an alternative fuel is for me not a kind of portal optimization thing, because there is so much money involved in the start. So you're going to optimize the current process. I would say now we already talked a little bit about just-in-time sailings. Mm-hmm. That's a big one. But others, for example, can be optimizing vessels that call multiple berths in one port. So, for example, feeder vessels and containers, they call, if you talk about Rotterdam, even up to 5 or 6 berths or terminals in one rotation, on one port call. And normally when you just have to go to one terminal, you have to deal with the berth planning of that only one terminal. Yeah. But when you go to 6, there are 6 berth planning that you have to take into account, which makes it a very complex puzzle with a lot of waiting times. So that's also, I think, one of the projects we see happening in other ports, like for example Hamburg as AFCCC. What they are doing a very good job over there. Rotterdam is also taking their some projects to work on that as well, to optimize or to first digitize that process and then to optimize that process. But also here, I think one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is, what am I going to optimize? Am I going to optimize the berth planning from the terminal? Or am I going to optimize the rotation of the feeder, so that the feeder can be out in time? Or am I going to optimize the cargo? So also you want, I think the most important thing is there is a reason why the feeder comes to the port, and that's because they have cargo they have to pick up or to deliver to the mainliners. So are you going to optimize that cargo flow? Are you going to, or is it the terminal or the feeder itself? I think to have that picture, so can you do all three? Mm-hmm. To a certain extent, that's important.
I think that must be very interesting discussions because those are also different people within the organization, different responsibilities. Yeah. Someone responsible for getting cargo in and making promises on cargo level. Someone responsible for the key planning. Someone responsible for the vessel alignment. How do you see these type of conversations evolve? Is there room already to have that discussion?
Yeah. So if there is pain at all these actors, and I think in this example there is, everyone has at least the intention to optimize, and the direction can maybe differ, or you have to come to compromises to find out what's worked for all of them. But at least, so if one of the parties would not feel any pain, so if the terminal would say, hey, we have space enough and we are not the problem, then that would be a different or more complex thing to solve. But I think nowadays, when everyone feels the pain or sees that there should be some change, mm-hmm. I would say that happens.
Okay. Yeah. And so that is the kind of good thing that the congestion, for instance, in a port like Rotterdam is bringing.
I would not use the word congestion. I would not use that word. But
the
of
pressure
course,
then.
Of course, when there is pressure and when everyone sees the potential,
And you also mentioned you were involved in the IMO, these kind of discussions. What is the contribution of these bodies to that discussion, like the ITPCO? What is the role that you see that they are playing?
Yeah, so I would say that changed over time. I would say that the first years, or like let's say 10 years ago until just a few years ago, maybe even sometimes now, it was more about studies. So to get awareness around the topic of port optimization, to do studies like, hey, IMO funded a study on the potential of just-in-time sailings. What can that save in CO2 reduction, for example? And I think the last years it's moving a little bit away from only doing studies and only creating awareness, and more to fund or to help ports with actual implementations of these kind of measures. Last year we did a big project in Teqplay Vodcast in Malaysia, where we helped so IMO Green Voyage, one of the parts of IMO, together with the terminal to do a project on the optimization of tugboat deployment. We did a very nice, so we did a lot of data analysis up front together. And when we had all these data and all these insights, we did a week at the terminal together with their continuous improvement team, to bring it into an action plan. How can you actually deploy your tugs better? How can they reduce their emissions? Some of the outcomes were very practical and were already implemented during that week, and some had implementation times till up to a year. But at least what we did there is to come up together with a plan, and that plan is actually used at that port and at the terminal, but also it can act as an example to other ports, at least in the region. Hey, we did this project to this port, can also be an interesting case study for you to look into. So it's creating so it started with informing, and now you see IMO is moving a little bit more to doing some actual trials or pilots that can also be kept as an example to other ports.
So leading improvement initiatives by providing resources, by making it discussable, by making it visible.
Yeah, and also, of course, one of the most important things I did not mention yet is standardization. So also IMO is, of course, a standardization body somewhere, which allows them and which helps people in the port domain with just the fundamental basics, I would say. You already mentioned DCSA, but I think around port optimization, most of the most important events and timestamp definitions, they came from IMO.
Yeah,
they are in line. So DCSA and IMO are using the same, but they came from IMO. Yeah.
No, but that's good to see that the standardization bodies are kind of aligning on the timestamps. Sure. It would have been a nightmare if that would have been different. Question in this improvement project that you were referring to in Pelepas, why did you choose tugs? Was that already decided up front? Was that something that was determined from the data? Why? That's a clear focal point, right?
Yeah. So so what we discussed with that port and with the terminal is, okay, where are we going to look after? So they really want to do. So they already had some other projects dealing with other parts of the port and the terminal. So that was the main focus where they asked us for help. So it was customer driven, I would say.
Like customer driven. Okay, clear. One of the interesting topics we had when we had a pre-chat actually was like we were discussing GIT and the importance of GIT, and then you kind of mentioned like maybe it's not GIT but it's GID because it's all all connected. Can you elaborate a bit more on what you mean by that sentence?
Of course. So just-in-time sailings, they imply that a vessel adjusts their speed, its speed to arrive at the right moment in time, so that she doesn't have to wait before the bird is free. But to allow, to give the vessel the right time she should be at the port, the vessel before on the bird lineup you should know her departure time, and what we see a lot in different ports is that the departure time of a vessel, it changes so much. There are so many last minute changes, or also I see sometimes vessels changing the departure time 24 hours before departure, that still the vessel is leaving 12 hours later than expected. Yeah, and if the vessel before you is leaving 12 hours later, it directly means when there's no other place at the terminal free, that your arrival time is also 12 hours later. So so we can say, hey, it's very important as a terminal that the arrival times are correct, but to get the arrival times correct, the most important factor is the vessel before, so the departure of the vessel before. And I would say when you do a project, or when you as a port you think about just-in-time implementations, I would say start with departure times. How good are my departure times? And if your departure times are more or less okay, then you start looking at your arrival times. And also here I would break it up. So for departure times, the most important factor why a vessel leaves is because the cargo operations are finished. That's the most important factor to look into. But also here, please look also into order times, for example, for nautical services. When you order them, do they say yes, or do they directly come with alternatives? And also look into actuals. So if they say they will be there at a certain time, was it also actually they were there as well or not? So planning versus actual is very important. In all parts of the process, for arrival, for departure. So that's also what we do normally when I do a project around just-in-time. We just divide the whole arrival and departure process in, I think, 5 steps around planning and actuals, and see where the delays come from. Yeah, that's what you have to solve first before you can even think about just-in-time.
And just-in-time is really the topic that everyone is mentioning. Any idea what the push is behind? Why is it not framed as GID, and is it framed as just-in-time arrival?
I know this when I have to write something about just-in-time arrivals or just-in-time. I don't use the word arrival anymore. I just say just-in-time, because you want a just-in-time sailing or just-in-time port call, which implies. So I think I use a framework where we just divide the whole port call or the whole trip of a vessel. So the inbound trip from the previous port until pilot boarding place is your just-in-time arrival, I would say. Yeah. And then from pilot boarding place to the berth is your just-in-time to the berth or something like that. And then you're talking about just-in-time departure again. So, and the whole process is just-in-time, but all 3 steps are important.
But and if I listen in well to you, you say like the predictability of the terminal is actually the terminal operations itself, the cargo operations, and the of course the nautical services which are surrounding it, that are the defining factor whether you will be able to implement just-in-time.
Of course, also other service providers like bunkers and stuff, they also make a difference. But indeed, like if we can go to a predictable departure time, I would say certainly 24, but preferably at least 48 hours before departure. That's where we have to aim for to be able to sail just-in-time with your next vessel. That's on your bird lineup.
If we would have this conversation, say again in 5 years, what do you feel that will have changed in 5 years? What are the things that are happening or that you expect to happen?
I hope a lot more ports are busy with the team, have it implemented. I know it's at this moment in time we see it mainly happening in ports that are container oriented, because it's easier than in bulk where there are where there's some contract related things in place that prevent them maybe for just-in-time sailings. I hope that's also bulk is taking action on that. I think there are some initiatives already working on that, but that has to become bigger and bigger because if you're a mixed port it's very difficult to always to allow the container vessel to sail distant time and to let the bulk vessels not do anything. So you need them both on the same page to actually drive that.
Especially if you are making use of the same resources, right? Then there is no way that you will get out of that.
Yeah.
Okay. So your expectation is it will now jump from the container, where already quite some effort has been put into it, more into the dry bulk and wet bulk areas.
And hopefully it's from talking a lot and first pilots or proof of concepts really to real implementations. You see it happening, so more and more ports are jumping into that car to move it forward. Mm-hmm. But yeah, let's hope there are steps further.
Of course, there have been quite some successes realized. If you look at the successes that have been realized, can you see any preconditions or conditions that make it easier or that help facilitate to have a successful implementation of a GIT project?
Yeah, it's all about stakeholder management. So for example, there is more in it for a shipping line or a carrier because they have direct savings in CO2 and in money. For a terminal, it's maybe less concrete, but if you also make a win-win in it for the terminal as well, that's the most important thing. Having all stakeholders involved from the beginning, find a common ground, and that's where you have to start. Yeah.
I think, that is actually the part I love about port calls. I'm really into collaboration. That's one of the key drivers of Teqplay as well. But having this conversation and about establishing something in joint, that is great. Rob, thank you very much for being in the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too.
And I'm looking forward to have this conversation again in 5 years and see where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.